Global military spending reached a record high of $2.44 trillion in 2023, but Africa's defense expenditure tells a different story, amounting to just $51.6 billion, a mere 2.1% of the world's total. African countries are left vulnerable. This uneven distribution of military power is reflected in the capabilities of individual African nations, with some possessing alarmingly weak armed forces. In this video, we bring you the weakest national military on the continent. Starting with number 10, Senegal. Senegal stands out as one of the weakest militaries in Africa, with an overall strength score of just 12 out of 100. The country's armed forces lack the capabilities to effectively address security challenges, largely due to its meager manpower of only 17,000 active personnel and limited military assets. Senegal possesses no battle tanks, just 4 naval assets, and its air force of 27 mostly helicopter aircraft provides little deterrence. This weakness is attributed to Senegal's defense budget of $345 million, despite its robust GDP of $31.14 billion. Rooted in its colonial past and post-independence struggles, Senegal has largely avoided major conflicts. Do you think there is hope that the government will prioritize military modernization and capacity building through increased defense spending and strategic partnerships? Number 9. Burkina Faso. Given Burkina Faso's strategic location in the Sahel region, which is prone to terrorism, addressing these challenges will require significant military modernization and capacity building, supported by increased defense spending and strategic partnerships. Burkina Faso's military, with an overall strength score of 10.9, ranks 9th among African militaries. Despite a robust GDP of $20.78 billion, the country's defense spending of $434 million is insufficient. The military lacks battle tanks and naval assets, with a manpower of only 12,000 active troops and 1,012 armored fighting vehicles. The Air Force, consisting mostly of older models, has only 21 aircraft. This weakness is rooted in Burkina Faso's historical struggles and political dynamics, including a recent military coup that diverted resources away from military modernization. How can Burkina Faso effectively address these security threats and enhance its military capabilities? Number 8. Mauritania. Mauritania's weak military is a concern in the Sahel region, with its porous borders and proximity to terrorism-plagued areas making it vulnerable to spillover effects. Mauritania's military, with an overall strength score of 10.6, has a large manpower of 31,500 active troops, yet ranks high as a weak military. The country's military equipment is largely outdated, with no battle tanks and only 5 naval assets, severely constraining its ground and maritime power, while the Air Force has 23 aircraft, including US-donated Cessna 208s. This fleet is insufficient for effective air support. What has contributed to Mauritania's military weakness, and how can it be addressed? The country's military weakness is rooted in its history of political instability and economic challenges, requiring increased defense spending, equipment modernization, and broader reforms to ensure long-term stability. Number 7. Gabon. Gabon's military has historically relied on French assistance, but this support has been disrupted by a recent military coup that ended the Bongo family's 56-year rule. Gabon's military, with a strength score of 10.2, is one of the weakest in Africa despite the country's relatively robust GDP of $19.32 billion in 2023. The lack of key military assets, such as battle tanks and a small fleet of only 10 naval assets, severely limits Gabon's ground and maritime capabilities. While the Air Force has 23 aircraft, including Mirage F-1 combat jets, this fleet is insufficient for effective air support. The political instability has raised concerns about the government's stability and the military's ability to maintain order, which is likely to negatively impact the country's security and its capacity to address regional threats. How can Gabon address its military weaknesses and ensure long-term stability and resilience in its armed forces? Number 6. Madagascar. Madagascar's military, with an overall strength score of 9.4, is one of the weakest in Africa despite the country's GDP of $15.76 billion in 2023. While on paper, Madagascar appears to have a sizable fleet of 386 battle tanks and 430 armored fighting vehicles, the reality is that much of this equipment is outdated and in poor operational condition. This mismatch between numerical strength and combat readiness raises concerns about the military's ability to effectively defend the country. Madagascar's military challenges are further exacerbated by its limited manpower of 13,000 active troops and low defense spending of only $110 million in 2023. The poor working conditions and low morale of soldiers have also undermined the cohesion of the armed forces. How can Madagascar address these shortcomings and enhance its military capabilities in the long run? Number 5. Somalia. Despite possessing 3,612 armored fighting vehicles, the armed forces lack critical assets like battle tanks, military aircraft, and have only 3 naval assets. Somalia's military is one of the weakest globally, with a GDP of $11.51 billion and defense spending of just $64 million in 2023. This overall limited strength, with a manpower of 17,500 active troops, is rooted in Somalia's tumultuous history. The country remained under a UN arms embargo since 1992, severely hampering military modernization until it was lifted in late 2023. However, Somalia's porous borders and proximity to terrorism raise concerns about its capacity to address these threats. Will increased defense spending and regional cooperation help Somalia enhance its military capabilities and maintain stability in the Horn of Africa? Number 4. Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone's military, with an overall strength score of just 5.7, is ranked number 4. The country's limited economic resources, reflected in its GDP of $3.52 billion and meager defense budget of $19 million in 2023, have severely constrained its ability to invest in military capabilities. Sierra Leone's military inventory is small and largely outdated, with only 2 tanks purchased from Ukraine in 1994 that are likely no longer operational, and a fleet of 104 aging armored fighting vehicles and 4 military aircraft. Despite having a manpower of 13,000 active troops, the military lacks the necessary equipment, training, and resources to effectively utilize this personnel. What unique challenges does Sierra Leone face in strengthening its armed forces compared to other weak militaries in Africa? Number 3. Benin. Benin's military inventory is severely limited, with a manpower of just 5,000 active personnel, no battle tanks, and only 2 military aircraft and 2 naval assets. Benin's military, with an overall strength score of just 5.45, is one of the weakest not only in Africa but globally. Despite the country's relatively robust GDP of $19.94 billion in 2023, its defense spending of only $75 million has severely constrained the development of its armed forces. While the country has received some French assistance in the form of armored fighting vehicles, this has not been enough to significantly enhance its military capabilities. Benin's reliance on foreign aid, particularly from France, underscores the weaknesses of its own defense forces, raising concerns about the country's ability to independently address security challenges and maintain national sovereignty. This is especially worrying in the context of the broader instability and terrorism threats plaguing West Africa, which have the potential to spill over into Benin's borders. Benin's military weakness is rooted in its history of political instability and economic constraints, with the country's small population and limited resources further hindering its ability to invest in a robust defense force. Addressing these shortcomings will require a comprehensive approach of increased defense spending, equipment upgrades, and personnel training, accompanied by broader economic and political reforms to ensure the long-term sustainability of the Beninese military. Number 2. Central African Republic. The country's limited economic resources, reflected in its GDP of $2.76 billion and defense spending of only $41 million in 2023, have severely constrained the development of its armed forces. The Central African Republic, CAR, stands out as one of the weakest militaries not only in Africa but globally, with an overall strength score of just 4.8. CAR's military inventory is severely limited, with a manpower of 10,000 active personnel, 3 tanks, 228 armored fighting vehicles, and 3 military aircraft, lacking any naval assets. While Russia has recently provided some military assistance, this is unlikely to significantly enhance the country's overall capabilities in the near future. The CAR's military weakness is rooted in its prolonged instability and conflict, which have diverted resources away from modernization efforts and made it difficult for the government to maintain control over the entire territory. This is a major concern in the context of the broader security challenges in Central Africa, with the limited capabilities of the CAR's armed forces raising doubts about their capacity to effectively respond to regional threats and maintain stability. Addressing the CAR's military weaknesses will require a comprehensive approach of increased defense spending, equipment upgrades, and personnel training, accompanied by broader political and economic reforms to ensure the long-term sustainability of the country's armed forces and the stability of the region. Number 1. Liberia. Liberia's military weakness is rooted in its tumultuous history of civil conflict and political instability, which devastated the country's infrastructure and institutions, including its military. With a GDP of just $4.35 billion and a meager defense spending of only $12 million in 2023, the country's armed forces are severely constrained. Liberia's military inventory is alarmingly sparse, with a manpower of just 2,000 active troops, no tanks, no military aircraft, and only 6 naval assets, mostly boats. This lack of key military equipment severely hampers the country's ability to project power and defend its borders, reflected in the deteriorating security situation and high crime rates. This legacy has made it extremely challenging for the government to rebuild and modernize its armed forces. Liberia's weak military is a concern in the broader context of regional security in West Africa, as its porous borders and limited power projection make it vulnerable to spillover effects from conflicts in neighboring states. Addressing these weaknesses will require increased defense spending, equipment acquisition, and personnel training, accompanied by broader political and economic reforms to ensure the long-term sustainability of the Liberian military. So these are the top 10 weakest African militaries. Larger economies like Benin and Gabon struggle to project military might, with Benin having no battle tanks at all and just 2 aircraft, while Gabon relies heavily on French assistance, which a recent coup has disrupted. These disparities in military strength across Africa raise concerns about the continent's ability to address security challenges, from terrorism to regional conflicts. As global powers battle for influence, the weakest links in Africa may become increasingly vulnerable. Why do you think these countries are behind in their military strength? And is their lack of such strength a threat to their sovereignty and national security? Let us know in the comments. While you are here, subscribe to TSN for more African content.